President Trump has made his new picks for his national security staff, and while they still need to pass through Congress to be approved, and while the majority of them still need to pass through the Senate to be approved, they definitely give us an indication on which direction that President Trump's new administration is going to take and what this really means for U.S. foreign policy going forward. Some of these picks make some sense, some of these picks were just kind of interesting, and some of them were just straight up head scratchers. We've got a lot of picks to talk about, so let's just get right into it. The first pick I want to talk about is Pete Hegseth for Secretary of Defense. This is a controversial pick for a number of reasons. Now, some background on Pete Hegseth. He's a major in the Army National Guard. He's a Fox News TV personality, and he does not have any significant experience leading a large organization in any kind of senior level position. He has extensive background, especially with the global war on terror, having deployed to both Iraq and Afghanistan as an infantry officer with the Minnesota National Guard. He graduated from both Princeton and Harvard, so he's very educated, and of course he's a former political candidate. He ran for a Senate seat, and he's been an outspoken Trump supporter since 2016. Other nominees for this position included retired Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, Mike Waltz, and Mike Pompeo. We'll talk about Mike Waltz here in a little bit because he actually got picked for a different role. Mike Pompeo is not going to have any role in this administration, and Keith Kellogg was just kind of left out. Now consider those others whenever you consider that he's one of the youngest secretaries of defense in U.S. history, and he doesn't have any large organizational leadership experience. Yes, he's an Army officer, but that'll really only take you so far up to the rank of, like, let's say Lieutenant Colonel or Colonel, where you do have some slightly larger organizational experience, but certainly nothing the size of the DoD, nothing like a corporate level experience. However, there is still some controversy around Pete Hegseth. He publicly advocated for Trump to pardon U.S. soldiers that were convicted of war crimes during the war in Afghanistan back in 2019. He criticized Senator Rashida Tlaib of having a Hamas agenda, also back in 2019. He supported Trump's decision to kill Iranian General Qasem Soleimani back in 2020, but while that decision kind of has its pros and cons, Pete Hegseth took it a step forward, calling for Trump to attack Iranian targets on Iranian soil, which is certainly a step up.
So what better time than now to say, we're starting the clock. You've got a week. You've got X amount of time before we start taking out your energy production facilities. We take out key infrastructure. We take out your missile sites. We take out nuclear developments. We take out popular capabilities.
He's also been a very vocal critic of what he's described as wokeness in the military. He's very against women being in combat roles in the military, and he also wants to de-wokify, or however you want to call that, the military.
I'm straight up just saying we should not have women in combat roles. It hasn't made us more effective, hasn't made us more lethal, has made fighting more complicated. We've all served with women, and they're great. It just, our institutions don't have to incentivize that in places where not traditionally, over human history, men in those positions are more capable.
Now, yes, he still needs to pass through Senate review, and he may face heavy scrutiny, if not for the controversies, then probably more for his lack of actual experience. That said, there are other appointments in this video that we're going to talk about that might raise some more flags over Pete Hegseth. Hegseth's nomination seems to me like more of a loyalty pick. His support for Trump and taking kind of more of a hardline stance, especially in foreign policy, kind of aligns with Trump's demeanor, especially on cases like Iran and also with China. So while he's very educated, he lacks the experience, he has some controversy around him, he's definitely more of a hawk than certain other individuals that could have been picks, but he's definitely in line in terms of hawkishness with some of the other picks that have been made so far. The general question here is whether or not there could have been another individual that's also loyal to Trump that would have had more leadership experience, that would have been more, I guess, capable of taking on a role like this from the jump. But having said all that, we'll just have to wait and see. Next up is Marco Rubio for the Secretary of State. This pick, I think, makes a lot more sense. Marco Rubio is not new to politics, but this will, I believe, be his first role in an actual White House cabinet. His approval by the Senate will make him the first Latino to hold the Secretary of State position in U.S. history, and this would likely solidify Rubio's rise in U.S. politics. He's held a seat in the Senate for a long time up to this point. While Rubio has no senior level experience, he's definitely no stranger to to foreign policy and America's foreign policy in particular. While in the Senate, he's served with the Senate Intelligence Committee through several terms, so he's held oversight positions in foreign policy and in intelligence, so none of this is going to be new to him per se. Rubio has developed a close relationship to Trump since they both ran in the 2016 Republican primary. While they were both at odds at that time, he's since worked to mend that relationship, and now we've seen them a little bit more close, especially since the 2020 and 2024 elections. Rubio is definitely a hawkish pick, especially when looking at Iran and China. He has called for a national boycott of Huawei products. He's also supported increased attention on China for their actions in the South China Sea. He's also been very hawkish against Iran, and I think that this kind of lines up with Pete Hegseth for Secretary of Defense. Rubio is very pro-NATO, and he has initially, at least at the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, supported U.S. aid to Ukraine. He has since softened on his stance for aid to Ukraine. However, his criticism of U.S. aid to Ukraine is more around the lack of long-term direction for U.S. aid to Ukraine, and not so much that we should or shouldn't be aiding Ukraine. And this is a bit of a theme with some of these individuals that have kind of softened their stance on aiding Ukraine. It's more about a lack of direction, and we'll talk about why that may be here at the end of this video. Overall, I think this pick is probably one of the stronger picks in his cabinet. We're going to talk about some other picks that definitely make a lot of sense with what his policy direction is and people that are capable of executing that policy. I think Rubio is an intelligent person. He's been rising in politics for a long time. He's familiar with Trump and he's familiar with foreign policy. He's a young guy. I think that this is probably a really good stepping stone for him for a future Republican campaign in a presidential election. But in either case, especially considering some of these other picks, I think that this makes a lot of sense, and this is probably the least controversial pick in his entire cabinet. He is likely to advocate to President Trump that we remain in NATO, which is good news, especially for our European allies. We'll definitely have to wait and see what that means for Ukraine specifically, given his softened stance and what President Trump decides to do with regards to that conflict. Next position will be Kristi Noem for Director of Homeland Security. Kristi Noem has extensive experience in U.S. politics. She served as South Dakota's lone House representative from 2011 to 2019. She also became South Dakota's first female governor in 2019. She's got a limited history in national security. She opposed President Obama's interventions in Syria and Libya, citing vague justifications and a lack of a long-term objective. Again, similar to Marco Rubio with Ukraine. A lot of the criticisms here with U.S. foreign policy has been a lack of long-term objective. As governor, she deployed the South Dakota National Guard to the Texas-Mexico border. However, reports later were revealed that this deployment was funded by a Tennessee billionaire and his wife. Legislation was later passed outlawing deployments of troops at the behest of a billionaire. Noem will primarily focus in this role on immigration, and she'll be working with Tom Homan, Trump's new border czar. We're going to talk about him here in just a little bit. But her history with the border provides a little bit of relevant experience for this role. Noem has been seen as capable of handling Trump's ambitious objectives for the next 4 years. She's likely to be very busy in her role, especially since Trump has placed a huge emphasis on deportations and working on illegal immigration. So we should expect to see a lot of visibility for her for the next few years. Next up is John Ratcliffe for CIA Director. Now, John Ratcliffe is one of Trump's more concerning picks. Ratcliffe served as Trump's Director of National Intelligence back in 2020 and 2021, and this was a very controversial time in Ratcliffe's career. Both Democrats and Republicans were very concerned about Ratcliffe's lack of prior professional experience in intelligence, but they were also concerned about just how political and outspoken he is, and they were worried that he was going to politicize the DNI position. As the DNI in that time, Ratcliffe referred to the intelligence community's 2016 assessment that Russia interfered in favor of Trump in that election as bogus. He claimed that Russia actually helped Hillary Clinton in that campaign more than Trump's. Again, as Director of National Intelligence, these aren't necessarily things that you should be going into, but he used his position as DNI to support Trump's political standing and score political points over actual intelligence objectives. Ratcliffe's appointment aligns with Trump's pattern of selecting loyal and familiar faces for key positions, especially in security roles. Ratcliffe may not be the ideal pick for the CIA, but it is considered more suitable for Trump politically speaking. The CIA is, of course, intended to be apolitical, focusing on foreign intelligence collection and analysis. Ratcliffe's appointment suggests a lack of trust in the CIA's integrity. And while there has been a general lack of trust amongst U.S. voters on the CIA and what it does, distrust doesn't just reach the U.S. voter base, it reaches some senior government positions as well. His leadership risks actually having the inverse effect than what I think think Trump might be intending, and it might in fact politicize the CIA pretty heavily. Very similar to his tenure as DNI. Next up is Mike Waltz for National Security Advisor. Now, Mike Waltz definitely marks a sea change for this position when compared to his predecessor, Jake Sullivan, who has been Biden's National Security Advisor. Sullivan certainly had a more reserved, risk-averse, and cautious, take on national security, especially when dealing with U.S. adversaries. Mike Waltz is probably going to be adopting a much more ambitious position, responding to aggression with aggression. This definitely aligns with Trump's demeanor on most things, so I think this makes a lot of sense for Trump. Mike Waltz has extensive experience in national security. He's the first Green Beret to join Congress. He has had multiple tours throughout the Middle East, Afghanistan, and Africa. He worked in the Pentagon under Secretaries of Defense Donald Rumsfeld and Robert Gates. His views on Afghanistan differ from the mainstream opinion. Pretty much everybody in the United States wanted to get out of Afghanistan and let it be over. He believed that the U.S. role in Afghanistan was a multi-generational conflict that should take over 100 years to actually bear fruit.
Until you're prepared to commit your grandchildren, not your children, but your grandchildren to stand shoulder to shoulder with my grandchildren and fight Islamic extremism, then you will never be successful here. So are we 15 years in? Yes. Are we in for a lot more fighting? And do we need a long-term strategy to undermine the ideology of Islamic extremism, just like we did fascism and just like we did communism? Yes, we do. Gordon, I think we're in for a long haul, and I think our nation's leadership needs to begin telling the American people, I'm sorry, we don't have a choice. We are 15 years into what is going to be a multi-generational war because we're talking about defeating an idea. It's easy to bomb a tank, very difficult to defeat an idea, and that's exactly what we have to do.
His views on China are definitely more of a Cold War perspective. He describes the U.S. as being in a new Cold War with the CCP. He initially supported aid to Ukraine. However, he's actually voted against aid to Ukraine in recent bills. Waltz entering into this position at an extremely tenuous time in world history. And with his mindset being different from Sullivan's, we're certainly going to see just how much that can actually impact the course of world history as it's heading right now. How much Trump follows Waltz's advice will be crucial to monitor. However, I would consider Waltz to be a capable pick for this role. Next up is Tom Homan for the Border Czar. Tom Homan's selection is pretty unsurprising given his extensive experience working on the border, especially with deportations. He was actually awarded the Presidential Rank Award in 2015 under President Obama, and he's been cited as the intellectual parent for the child-parent separation policy during deportations. He actually, when confronted about that policy, stated that, quote, nobody wants to be separated from their children, later acknowledging that it has an effect. He continued in his role under President Trump, being promoted in 2016 and 2018 as director of ICE. 2018, he actually stepped down from that role. However, in that time, from 2016 to 2017, deportations increased by 38%. He even publicly stated that illegal immigrants, quote, should be afraid, and that, quote, aliens commit more crimes than U.S. citizens. After leaving the government in 2019, he joined the Heritage Foundation and contributed to Project 2025, proposing mass arrests, detentions, and deportations. He actively supported Trump's presidential campaign, and he aligned Trump's deportation goals with Project 2025's deportations. The Washington Post described Homan as someone who deports people, and he's really good at it. Obviously, we know that Trump has made deportations and illegal immigration a massive focal point in his domestic policy here for the next few years, and he picked a very capable individual with a lot of experience to do just that. He'll be working under Kristi Noem, the Homeland Security Director, to accomplish this goal. And while Homan's policy of separating parents from their children during deportations, at least I would consider to be very immoral, he definitely argues, and we can see to some degree that it does have a psychological effect on parents trying to bring their whole families across the border illegally. Next up is Tulsi Gabbard as the Director of National Intelligence. Tulsi Gabbard has extensive foreign policy experience. Just as a background, she's a lieutenant colonel in the Army Reserves. She's a longtime Democratic congresswoman, and she ran for president under the Democratic ticket back in 2020. Her views, however, are fairly controversial. During the Arab Spring and the Syrian Civil War, she stated that Assad was not America's enemy, and she even personally met with Assad, which drew bipartisan criticism. She ultimately withdrew from the presidential race due to backlash on that very incident. Her more recent controversies have come from the Russian invasion of Ukraine. On the first night of Russia's invasion, she tweeted that the U.S. should not have ignored Russia's warning lines about Ukraine being in NATO and saying that this was effectively the United States' fault. And for days after the war began, she continued to state tweets basically of a similar direction, basically implying that the war in Ukraine was America's fault. Now, these statements reinforce kind of a common trope that Russia has often cited, that this war is basically America's fault and it revolves around Ukraine. However, again, and those of you that have watched this channel and are familiar with what Putin has actually specifically said about this conflict, really doesn't have much to do with the United States at all. It has more to do with Putin's ambitions around Ukraine and his desire to incorporate Ukraine back into Russia. There's really no place for the U.S. This argument is more just to mute U.S. pressure in Ukraine's favor. Now, her impact as the director here, she's going to be bringing a new energy to this position, and that energy may or may not be a good thing. Her appointment could be very divisive, especially depending on what your stance is on her past views. Supporters of a less interventionist U.S. foreign policy may really like her appointment. That being said, it's Director of National Intelligence. It is by design not to be a politicized position, but it also isn't really much of a big vocal foreign policy position. It's more about intelligence collection and analysis and dissemination. So I wonder if this is just a position to put Tulsi Gabbard so she's in the administration, but not necessarily to utilize her for her actual opinion. That being said, her outspoken beliefs might alienate some U.S. intelligence partners, and that might pose some challenges for the United States more broadly, especially with our allies when sharing intelligence. Next up is Mike Huckabee as the ambassador to Israel. Now, Mike Huckabee's appointment to Israel definitely makes a lot of sense within Trump's personal belief on Israel. He's a big supporter of Israel, and you probably can't find a bigger supporter of Israel in U.S. politics than Mike Huckabee. He will be entering into this position at a critical time when Israel has ongoing wars in Gaza and Lebanon, and with a war against Iran looming. And the U.S. relationship with Israel and the U.S. role in the Middle East is certainly continuing to be in question, and really we're looking for a direction where we should be going in this conflict. Now, Huckabee's background on Israel will definitely give you an indication on where we're going here. He's a former governor of Arkansas. He's an evangelical Christian, and he has strong support for Israel. He referred to the West Bank by its biblical name of Judea and Samaria when asked about Israeli annexation of the West Bank, and he actually supports the idea that Israel should be able to annex the West Bank. His role as the U.S. ambassador to Israel will solidify the Trump stance in favor of Israel. Now, Trump's selections here indicate a commitment to an aggressive foreign policy and border strategy throughout his next term. While he may not necessarily be deliberately interventionist or seeking a fresh war against a country like Iran or Russia or China, he definitely will be taking a hardline stance when dealing with those countries, especially with the conflict looming. Of course, his key foreign policy areas for now is going to be reaching a peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine to end that war as soon as possible. We'll see exactly how that's done. I've talked about that in a past video. He's also going to be looking at China with a looming conflict over Taiwan, and he's going to be looking at Iran. And Iran, I mean, boy, they are dealing with potential conflict with Israel. They have been tied to multiple assassination attempts of Trump himself and other prior administration officials. Iran's going to have some bullseyes on them. His domestic foreign policy obviously is going to be very weighted towards anti-illegal immigration and mass deportation, and he's got individuals in place to take care of just that. All that he needs now is for Congress to approve some of these picks. He will be enjoying a Republican majority in both chambers, and so it might be easy for him to actually pass some of these nominations. Some of his other nominations that we've not mentioned here in this video, like Matt Gaetz for Attorney General, that might have a little bit more controversy and division, even in the Republican Party over that kind of pick, but we're not going to talk about that here. Now, those are the picks so far, but what matters next is going to be their performance and their roles. Trump has appointed a lot of capable individuals. He's appointed some intelligent individuals that don't have a lot of experience, and he's really appointed some very kind of confusing individuals in some positions.
What's going on over here?
He showed in his first administration that he has kind of a quick trigger finger with firing individuals that he feels are not doing an effective enough job. So we'll just have to wait and see if he ends up having to use his trademark phrase, "You're all fired." With all that being said, I want to hear your thoughts on this. So like this video if you found it helpful or informative. That also really helps this video reach new audiences. Comment your thoughts on what you think of any of these picks, even the ones that we didn't talk about. There have been some very interesting picks, and I'm sure that people will have some thoughts. And subscribe to this channel for more analysis on conflicts and national security. With all that being said, see you later next time.